the thing that I've learned too is the American dream is different for each person because they're different people.
Mhm.
And that is really living the life you want to live, having the freedom to live life you want to live. And that could be at an associate level. But if we look around, where would we be as a country, as an organization without people that value that role and are valued in that role?
Welcome to ReedFlections, a podcast on life, leadership, and learning. I'm Art Calderon, here with Reed Nyffeler. Reed is a husband, a father, a CEO of a growing global security franchise organization, and, of course, a seasoned podcaster. We've talked about a lot this season. We're here in season 2. We talked about developing authentic and intentional leaders. We've started with why develop leaders, why would someone want to do that. We moved into who you should develop, so we got specific about that. Finally, then we moved into what capacities do leaders need, and currently, where in the organization can leaders grow? There's several kind of traditional roles we're going to be looking at over these next few podcasts. The associate level, manager level, director, vice president, and ultimately the C-suite. Today, we're talking about the associate level, kind of an entry-level position. And not all organizations are set up in this traditional way, right? They have some, you've heard of maybe a matrix organization, right? But we're talking about a traditional level, our traditional organizational structure. And how is having a more traditional organizational structure support leadership development?
Yeah, first of all, traditional, I mean, we consider traditions really in the last 30 or 40 years because this organizational structure is relatively new, right? I mean, I would say in the 1900s to later. I mean, before that, you kind of had an apprentice model, right? I mean, you would stay in your family business and you would work under your father or family member and then learn the business and you'd ultimately take it over. And there wasn't any big organizations, right? And so with the advent or the turn of the century, you begin to see organizations get much bigger, right? They would employ more than just the family and friends, and it was kind of manifestation into that. And I believe a lot of that was driven by the access to information, right? Because before, the only way to get trained was on your family farm or at the blacksmith shop or whatever trade
You had
you were
to be
doing.
with the person
Right.
who's going to, yeah, okay.
And so then as you began to see the printing press and transference of information, now you can, broaden your horizons as transportation of goods and services came. And so that predicated a challenge to then add hierarchical organizations. But you could see, and I think Henry Ford was kind of an early instigator of that because he created, instead of a car being made by one person in every part, he then divided the roles and responsibilities to individuals. That's where you saw the modern day hierarchy of organizations, right? And so they had an associate level that would then work on just manufacturing the tire for the Model T or whatever the case might have been. And so now we've kind of to build on top of this, which creates scalability and sustainability, right? Because that's what an organizational structure will do. Before, if you look at organizations that were, familial in that regard and they're training people downstream, you'd be stuck in that role. And then if the family or the patriarch died or there wasn't somebody to carry that on or they didn't want to do it, then that organization stopped. And that's why you don't see a lot of enduring organizations. But now that we have this organizational structure, we see that regardless of the leader, that organization will go forward. And as I've studied this throughout time, you can see that a lot of organizations were based upon their name, right? I mean, right as I graduated college, I worked for Black & Decker. Well, those are the two last names of the founders.
Mhm.
However, now people don't name it based upon the organization's leaders because they have organizational structure that can carry on beyond the leaders, right? I mean, let's look at Apple. It wasn't Jobs and Co., right?
Yeah.
It was Apple. And now after Steve Jobs passed away, they've built on top of that. And so it creates an organization that can be passing along. So why are organizational structures critical? Because if you want to build anything that has enduring value or could be transferable or sold, you want to have an organizational structure that is established that will carry on to the new leader. And that starts with the associate role. And so that is really the history of all of that. And so, as I look throughout my career, there's probably no role that was more critical for me to learn and understand than the associate role. And many times we think, well, you're the CEO and that's easy for you to say. And
Uh-huh.
I always harken back to the associate level roles that I had
Mhm.
because I understand the responsibility that's there. And I always tell all of our officers in our security business that the brand actually lives with you.
Mhm.
it's identified by the customers when they walk up and
Yeah.
they see you. They
The
these
customers don't ever talk to the CEO.
no,
Almost never.
almost never. And if they are talking to me, it's either one at the beginning of the opportunity or a problem within the
Uh-huh,
opportunity. And
uh-huh.
so the associate is what embodies that. I mean, think about the thoughts we have around any brand, right? I mean, let's look at airlines, let's look at hotels, let's look at any big brands, right? I mean, the airline flight attendant is the person that we reflect upon that brand. Likewise at hotel. I mean, we're talking to the person checking us in, or the person that's ultimately cleaning the rooms. And so those are the people that essentially reflect the brand. And so that
Right.
associate role could not be more critical, which is why it's super critical for me because, even as I started the organization I'm operating now, one of the first things I did was actually take a role and put on an officer uniform and perform patrols and be at the front lines. And it just gives you an appreciation for the energy required, the focus necessary, the training required. And I still go back to that all the time. And that's
So you would
throughout.
say that that's helpful for a leader to serve in the associate role?
Yeah. And I think what was different than most people in an associate role is my perspective.
Hmm.
My perspective was not, hey, I just need a paycheck this week.
Uh-huh.
My perspective is, what can I learn in this role that'll be of value later in my career? And that's really what people should take away from that is saying, we can look at it in two different perspectives, saying, I got to go to work today, and they're underpaying me, and I mean they don't value me,
Uh-huh.
and all that other stuff. Instead of saying, okay, what can I learn, and what role will I take from this, so that as I'm a manager, as I'm a director, as I'm a vice president, that I can empathize with the people in that role and create an environment that's sustainable, that would want to get them to stay and endure long term. And so that's always the mindset that I took, saying, okay, what are my thoughts and feelings and even emotions at that level around that role? And what did I not like or not like about management that I would otherwise change if I were in those roles versus just being a byproduct or a victim of those circumstances? I was always looking at ways to change that when I stepped into a greater role. And that was required to do that mindset. It's really a mindset shift at that associate level.
I've seen you share stories to rooms of guards and former guards who are now in leadership positions.
Hmm.
And whenever you start talking about, well, when I was a guard, when I did this, and you start talking, usually you talk about some funny mistake you made, but everybody in that room is locked on. Like, what? This the CEOs actually put on the uniform and worked at 3 a.m, and that really provides that connection.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, as a leader, we should always develop stories that are the most universally applicable, right? And so if we're going to
Right.
tell a story that's one time that happened one off, it's not relatable.
Yeah.
Yet, stories or even parables are designed to make them the most relatable, right? And so, and the majority of the populace either has worked or is working in an associate level role for many different choices. And I think, many times we may say, oh, I'm just an associate. Well, sometimes that's exactly what you and your family need, right? At that stage in life. And I've worked with many employees and they're like, well, I don't really have aspirations to go growing forward. I said, perfect. I need people I can count on in
Hmm.
that area. And I want you to embody the brand. And every day you're here, represent that well. I've talked to military leaders that have taken a step at a lower level in the organization that I've managed people and I don't have an interest in doing that, but I'm going
Hmm.
to be a diligent employee and show up every day. And I'm like,
Right.
that's exactly what I want.
That's valuable.
That's valuable.
Yeah.
And, the thing that I've learned too is the American dream is different for each person because they're different people.
Hmm.
And that is really living the life you want to live, having the freedom to live life you want to live. And that could be at an associate level. But if we look around, where would we be as a country, as an organization without people that value that role and are valued in that role?
My father-in-law, he was did a lot of manufacturing. He's VP of manufacturing of different organizations across the country. Did a lot of hard work. Was in charge of a lot of people, and then he retired, and he got a job at a sporting goods store in Colorado um, as a sales associate, and that's all he does. And you know what? He does not want to move into management now. He doesn't hesitate to tell management what they should do better. They'll have like these staff meetings. He tells them, all the stores, and you can imagine you have a lot of these probably like younger people that are selling the sporting goods, and they're just waiting to be told what to do. And he's waiting to see how he could fix things, And he'll raise his hand and he'll ask this question that is way above his pay grade because he's been there before, and now he's a sales associate, but he's not he's not intimidated. He's not afraid to speak his mind, and they love him there because he comes every day early. He works, does a great job, is meticulous. How can leaders keep these individual contributors feeling valued and not just like, oh, I'm just like you said, I'm somebody who can be gone and no one cares about me and my contribution's not valued. How does a leader keep that person valued?
Yeah, and I think first of all, I'm sure that organization loves having your father-in-law there because, as an associate, we need someone to mentor us, right? We need someone alongside us that can show us kind of the ropes and what to do. And in his case, he's had a myriad of experiences that allow for him to give perspective that's otherwise there. And so that's super critical. And I think there's a huge leadership void in America, right? And really across the world. And so associates don't understand the benefit or power of being an associate because they're leadership or managers that's there. So how do we become, and this is of course a subsequent episode, but an effective manager is
Mhm.
understanding the role of that associate. I lean on that all the time. I mean, whether we're designing software or processes, I am always first thinking of the associate. What they are the volume of that all, right? I mean, and I think that also clouds judgment as leaders. We have to remove our, vantage point or viewpoint away from that because I'm at an organizational level now that I see the entire organization.
Mhm.
But where I always start is with the associate. And, any business is a microcosm or a macro effect of a single unit of experience. So in our case, right, if one officer has a great experience, I build on top of that. And I get 2 officers, 10 officers, 100 officers, and then they create a great experience for the customer. That's how it's built. Not saying, hey, we're doing hundreds of millions of dollars. How do we work our way down from there? It's always starting that 1 hour, one officer, one experience, and we build up from there. And so most businesses start with a single transaction, right? Think of it, even if you use your global brands like McDonald's. If they can't make one burger well and have an employee that is happy to make that burger and deliver that to someone, then how can they do that in the millions on a daily
Mhm.
basis, right? And so it always starts at an associate level, and then you scale from there. And so that understanding that perfect experience that will drive revenue and bring others in is super super critical.
Now, what would your advice be to someone who is in this role? Maybe they're at an associate level. They're at an entry level position. Maybe they have aspirations to grow, and it's a little hard to see that, right? Maybe they want to be at a certain level, but they're not. Right now, they're just associate level, and it's hard to see what it could be. Um, what would you say to someone who has aspirations for something to grow within an organization, currently just at an associate level, or currently at an associate level?
Yeah, and it reminds me of a story I read one time that said everything I needed to know in life I learned in kindergarten. And essentially, it's like, if you really look back, that's so true, right? We learned how to share toys with others, right? We learned how to interact with different personalities that came from different family environments. We learned how to read and write and how to
Hmm.
learn ultimately. And I think that's exactly the case of an associate level, right? Is saying you're going to have people, and you have a wide variety of those people, certainly at an associate level, that you're going to work with, that you're going to have to learn how to manage and draw out talents and challenge and encourage. Um, Throughout that process. And so when I was there at an associate level, and I worked at many different organizations at an associate level, right? I worked at a pizza place here locally. I was a buffet stocker, so I'd fill the buffet. And so I had to interact with customers that would come
Uh-huh.
through, and of course I had to, interact with the hostess stand, and that was, as a high school guy, typically you're long, and so you.
Best part of the
That's
job.
right. I mean, you're meeting the hostess stand at slower times. You had the wait staff that you were, preparing for, and then ultimately I worked in construction at an associate level. And so that was physically draining, right? I mean, and there's all sorts of walks of life, right? And I learned different language at that time, not only a secondary language, but maybe some more colorful language that I hadn't considered before in my vocabulary that I
Yeah.
didn't add. I mean, those are just things all across the board. And then, even as I was in production, I mean, I remember in college, I was literally filling boxes for shipments for power tools, or they were like drill bits and things of that nature. And so you begin to see this nature of sorting and organizing and all those other things that become super critical
Uh-huh.
later. And so I understand at many different organizations those associate roles that I took on, and understood, okay, there's things that are different in each role, but there's things that are the same. And then there's things that I liked in each role and things that I didn't like. And I liked a balance of autonomy, but if I didn't have a clear defined job or responsibility, I didn't feel like I was adding value. So now as a leader, I'm like, okay, if that associate doesn't know what they need to do each and every day, where they add value, that's going to be a challenge. So I'm like, hey, if they need to know, and this is really a part of the previous podcast series, but it's really daily and hourly. That's where an associate needs to live. We need to make sure they understand what they need to do each day and how we divide that responsibility each hour and make sure there's value. And if we get too tight and within that hour, like minute by minute, that's considered micromanagement at an associate level. But have daily direction and hourly expectations, and then let them kind of determine how to best execute on that as an associate level. And so that I understand that now at a later stage in life, that I can craft that there's clarity around what needs to be done each hour and how much needs to be accomplished in a day, and that's an appropriate direction for an associate.
So talk a little bit more about that. Flip it now. So now, instead of an associate, what would you say to someone who is in a leadership role, has people reporting to them, and what is their perspective given the fact that that they're actually in this leadership role now?
Yeah. So again, focusing on the associate in this regard is, we want to be recognized as an associate for our consistency in our performance, right? What you draw attention to as a leader will be repeated. So if you're drawing attention to their mistakes, they're going to try and avoid their mistakes, but likely repeat them. If you draw attention to their successes, they're likely going to focus on having more frequent successes so they can be recognized again. And so that's what we should do as a leader, saying, hey, thank you for coming. I can always count on you, right? That in our organization, and I believe this to still be true, we have an employee of a franchisee that for 10 years has not missed a shift. 10 plus years. That is the model of consistency.
We love you, buddy.
Yes. His name is Chris.
Yeah.
And, he's not sick. I mean, and things happen. I mean, he's had, family circumstances happen, but that's just a level of commitment. And that's just inherently who he is.
Right.
And that is to be applauded, right? How many times as leaders are we looking at, I got this open shift, or this person's a problem in my organization, or whatever the case might be, instead of recognizing, hey, thank you for coming every day and doing a phenomenal job, and someone we can count on, that the customers trust, and you're really building a rapport and relationship with them. And so we as leaders want to recognize consistent behaviors, and it becomes so blasé because we're so used to it. We're so used to that person showing up each and every day, and they aren't a problem. And that's ultimately what we're going to do.
You kind of take it for granted.
You absolutely take it for granted.
Yeah. Now talk a little bit about the importance of being able to recognize and spot talent in associates. You're a leader, you're a manager, whatever your position is, and how important is it for you to take the time and the energy and the resources to be on the lookout for some potential leadership that you see in your associates?
Yeah, I think as you're identifying talent, there's really two components that are critical. One is that talent something that's circumstantial or consistent? Sometimes we need circumstantial talent, right? If I'm going to have heart surgery, I want someone that's really good in that circumstance to essentially perform heart surgery. However, in an associate level, I'm looking for somebody consistent, right? Because they're really around the daily and hourly. And so we want someone that is talented, that gets high level of self-discipline. Why? Because if they become a manager and they have low self-discipline, that's going to permeate throughout the team. And so as we're identifying talent, we want to see who they consistently are, not who they are circumstantially, because we need that consistency at that level. And so I really look at saying, okay, what behaviors and relative self-discipline do they have that I can count on them? And they're going to be regular in that regard. And that's going to be the model of behavior they're going to share with the group pervasively. And so that's where I see the talent saying, wow, this person's really got it together. They are every day, they're in our case in uniform and have that all together. They're on time. They're thoroughly prepared for the moment. And then as the moment comes, they're comfortable in it, right? They're not overwhelmed by it or distracted. And so those are little simple things as opposed to one moment of heroism that ultimately is not going to ever be repeated.
Yeah, that reminds me of my time in the Army. We had good field soldiers and we had good barrack soldiers. A good field soldier was someone who was tough and was able to push through the rigors of being out in the field and the physical activity. But once you got them back in the barracks and gave them a little freedom, these guys would fall apart. They would show up late. They wouldn't come to formation. But man, they were tough in the field. Problem is, we couldn't live in the field.
Yeah.
And those were the guys who didn't get promoted up much, and they often weren't successful with their careers. But someone who could manage themselves and manage others, could handle the tough parts when they came up, but in the rest of the world were able to work well within the system. Those are the ones who ended up making careers and ended up rising in leadership.
Yeah, and many times you need to balance both, right? I mean, and that's if you're an associate and you are really good in circumstances, right? Instead of consistency. One, work on your consistency. Two, find a place where that circumstance you're really good in is frequent, right? And so if it's in the military and you need to be on the front lines to you do that versus say in the barracks where you're more consistent, et cetera. So it's really understanding where you're at and which roles. And I know there's a lot of roles, and you have I'm sure a series of your favorite roles. What I've witnessed is the cinnamon roll seems to be one of your favorite roles, Art. But
I do
ultimately,
like a good cinnamon roll.
yeah. And I've seen you eat Tootsie Rolls and
Yes.
Crescent Rolls and all
Yeah.
sorts of rolls. But regardless of that, at an associate level, they all appreciate the rolls, right? I mean, that's one thing I would say is we can give them appreciation is uh, sometimes food is in jest. If food is a good way to recognize that behavior. And I've
Sure.
learned that it's a communal a breaking of bread, in
Yeah.
this case, specifically rolls, and helping them recognize and understand that we value them, right?
Right.
And sometimes as a leader, it's just that simple recognition that,
Right.
hey, I took time to say hi and recognize your role. And every time I am anywhere in the field, I step aside to see an officer and I focus on them. If I'm walking with a franchise owner or a leader, I will walk over to the person that's at that front lines, leaving the conversation I have with that
And
leader.
what an impact for that frontline worker, right? This is the CEO come and talk to me, That I think that's excellent. Yeah. Well, here we are at the end of our time once again. Episode 15, folks, associate and individual contributors. Thank you, Reed, for sharing with us. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We appreciate each and every one of you. Next week, episode 16, managers. So we're following that sort of that next chain up to managers. We're going to continue to evaluate the role, particularly of a manager, in the traditional organizational structure. All right. In the meantime, I'm Art Calderon. Be purposeful.
And for the last word, there is nothing more valuable than the role of an associate, right? That is a starting point for everyone and really the point of contact with your brand, your business, and the organization. And if you are a leader and you're leading the associates, recognize that this is the most valuable role. Plan your business, empathize with the associate, and really understand their role. If you're an associate and you're just getting started, change your perspective. Recognize that this is not just an hourly job that you're getting paid, but really understand what the organization is trying to accomplish with you and through you so that as you elevate to other roles or as you maintain that position, you can be of even greater value to the organization. And as you provide value, that value will be reciprocated back to you. Thank you for watching and listening this week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.